Hey everyone, it's David Chen. Let's talk about Eternals, the latest Marvel film. Short version, I love this movie and I'm confused by all the hate it's getting. Let's get into it. One quick note, this review will contain extremely minor plot details. I do not consider these spoilers, but you have been warned. If you want to go in completely fresh, just watch the movie first, then come back to this video review. Also, if you're new to my channel, hello, I'm David Chen. I regularly post about movies and TV with the occasional tech review thrown in there. Be sure to hit like or subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit that bell icon to get notified whenever I post something new. So, Eternals. The story for this movie is a little bit complicated. In fact, it's so complicated it's one of the few Marvel films I think that actually uses an opening text crawl. I actually think the text crawl was a little bit unnecessary, but whatever. Short version, it turns out there's these extremely powerful beings called the Celestials, and they have sent down other powerful beings, less powerful, called the Eternals to planets such as Earth. The Eternals have been here for many thousands of years, and their job is to stop these creatures called the Deviants. Deviants are really dangerous, they want to kill humans and other forms of life, and so the Eternals have to stop them. Now, the Eternals are pretty powerful beings. They each have a distinct personality with a distinct set of abilities. And during the course of this movie, they discover a new and unanticipated threat that they have to deal with. That's all I'm going to say about the plot for now. Now, you might be asking, wait a second, if these Eternals were here the entire time, why didn't they help us stop Thanos? Or why didn't they participate in the Battle of New York? Well, the movie has an answer for that. It's because they were only here to stop deviants and they were asked to not do anything else.
Why didn't you guys help fight Thanos?
We were instructed not to interfere in any human conflicts unless deviants are involved.
Well, I guess that answers all of my questions. I have absolutely no follow-ups of any kind. Okay, putting that aside, because I can forgive that, because whenever you want to introduce characters that have kind of been here the whole time, you have to have some explanation for why they didn't help out with the previous Marvel stuff. I actually really like this movie, and I'm going to tell you a few reasons why. First, the cast. The cast members are all really talented, and they have great chemistry with each other, which is not always a given with a movie like this. I really like how they bounce off each other, and in particular, their abilities are pretty cool. The movie does take shortcuts by necessity. This movie's 2.5 hours long, but even in that time, it has so much it needs to do. It needs to introduce each of the 10 Eternals, tell you a little bit about them, their backstory, maybe even give them a little character arc. It needs to introduce their abilities. Then it needs to set up this whole universe with Celestials, and then whatever the main conflict is, which again, I'm not going to get into. It's a lot to do in one movie, and I think the movie basically handles it pretty well, but again, it paints in broad brushstrokes. So like, as an example, you see two characters flirting, and then basically that's kind of a sign that they're in love with each other or they have this big love story. That kind of thing, these kinds of shortcuts are taken. I didn't mind it for this movie. Marvel films in general often paint with broad brushstrokes, and I think this movie's no different. If you're used to that kind of storytelling, I think you'll be right at home with Eternals. As a bonus, this is also one of the most diverse casts for a blockbuster film possibly ever. You have all different ethnicities and people of different abilities and sizes and shapes represented here, and I think it's awesome. Now, it is important to note that these are not human characters. They are technically Eternals that look like people of these different abilities and races. And I don't think the movie really reckons with that gulf, unfortunately. So it is a missed opportunity there. But just from a pure casting perspective, it's nice to see all these different faces on screen. I also love that this movie does something very different than other Marvel films, just in terms of its vast time scale. Do you remember how in Transformers, like last night or whatever, you found out that Transformers were responsible for all these events throughout human history, like the Underground Railroad or World War II and fighting Nazis and stuff like that? That's kind of what the Eternals does for the Marvel Universe. It's like these characters were involved in many developments in human civilization, and it's a little bit silly, but it's also kind of interesting to think about. You know, like all these events in human history happened in the way they did, and there's many questions about why things played out the way they did. And Eternals, the movie, tries to kind of answer those questions by saying, aha, did you know that the Eternal characters were involved in that? Like, there's a character in the movie named Icarus who's apparently responsible for the Greek myth of Icarus, you know, stuff like that. And I just think it's a fun mental exercise. Kind of cheesy, but if you enjoy that kind of thing, this is kind of like alternate history, you know, historical fiction type of reflection, then I actually thought it was pretty interesting. This movie does make you kind of reflect on, you know, the vast sum of human experience in a way that other Marvel films don't. On that note, let's talk about Marvel film connections and how this movie plugs into the MCU, which is, It doesn't really. I mean, it introduces concepts that I'm sure will be reused in the MCU, but there are very few Marvel connections. Other than that reference to Thanos I made earlier, I mean, I would say that this movie is pretty standalone, and that to me is actually a bonus. I think we have tons of MCU stuff that connects with each other, and it's always fun to see movies like this that kind of are their own thing and don't really connect too much with everything else that's happening. Finally, I really love the action scenes in this film. Now, I will say it took me a while to get into it. When you are first introduced to the Eternals, they're all kind of doing their own thing, using their abilities, and the visual effects to me didn't look super great, didn't look super convincing, and I was just confused. I was like, I don't know what's happening. Like, who are these people? Why are they acting in the way they're doing? Like, what are even their powers? And so it did take me a while to understand what was actually going on, but that's cleared up pretty quickly. And there end up being like one or two big action scenes in the movie where like everyone's using their abilities differently that I thought were just completely exhilarating. I really appreciated seeing these characters use their powers in different ways that I thought were really creative. And it actually honestly reminded me of the first time I saw Joss Whedon's The Avengers and seeing how like, oh, these powers can combine to do something really cool in a way that each character individually wouldn't be able to achieve. My favorite character in the movie was Makari, who is played by Lauren Ridloff. She's kind of the super fast character like Quicksilver or the Flash or Superman. And I just loved how quickly she moved and how her visual effects were conceived and executed. It just was really breathtaking to me. And I also just think she's a wonderful actress. So anyway, seeing her, seeing the other Eternals do their thing, I just thought was great. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room for Eternals, and that is the Rotten Tomato score. Apparently, this is one of the worst rated movies in the MCU by film critics. And I just want to reflect on why that might be. I do want to start by saying I don't think anything weird is happening with the film critic Rotten Tomato scores. I don't think film critics are rating this movie differently because of the cast or because of stuff that Kevin Feige has said or whatever. This movie was review bombed on IMDb by online trolls, but trolls got a troll, so like I'm putting that aside. I think people just didn't like this movie. And there's a few reasons I can speculate on for that. You know, I've read a bunch of the reviews, and here are some of my thoughts on why this movie didn't resonate with a lot of critics. First of all, as I mentioned, this movie does try to do a lot. It's a 2.5 hour long runtime, but even then, it still doesn't necessarily feel like enough because you're introducing these 10 Eternal characters, what their powers are, what their relationships are, plus the main conflict, plus this concept of Celestials and Deviants, like all this stuff you're trying to get across to the audience. And I can understand why some people might feel like it didn't do a good enough job. It didn't have enough room to breathe. Imagine if you were trying to make like the Avengers, but you didn't have time to introduce each character with their own individual movie, right? Imagine if it was like just, hey, these are the Avengers and we're kind of introducing each of their backstories and their powers and so on. You might feel this movie is overstuffed and rushed and bloated and not particularly effective. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why people are not liking this movie. Another thing I've seen people talk about are the visual effects, and I can totally understand why the visual effects didn't work for some people. They do look occasionally quite cheesy. It is a very distinct aesthetic that is a little bit different than other Marvel films. But more importantly, the movie hugely relies on the visual effects. So if the visual effects don't work for you, or if you don't think they look good, then you're not going to have a good time with the movie. So I totally understand why if you don't think the visuals are good, you're not enjoying Eternals the movie. The final thing I'll say is that for many years, Marvel has been trying to combine indie film sensibility with big budget blockbuster spectacle. And we've seen them do this in their hiring of all these different indie film directors and, you know, giving them a massive budget to make a, you know, Marvel film. Think about very recently, Destin Daniel Cretton, who has made relatively small films, but then was tasked with making Shang-Chi, right? And there's many other examples of this in the past. At its best, this approach is able to combine some of the better qualities of these directors with the kind of spectacle that we're used to from Marvel. I personally think Eternals does that successfully. But in this case, here you have Chloe Zhao, who is known for making beautiful, meditative, slowly paced movies. Sometimes movies that barely have a plot. And you're trying to have her make a movie called Eternals, which has all these characters, all these stakes, on the biggest scale you can imagine, right? And I understand why people think that that marriage didn't work, right? Like they found it to be unwieldy or they found it to be a combination that didn't really make sense. For me, it worked because I thought what Chloe Zhao brought to this was a sense of, honestly, the beauty of the world and of the vast scale of humanity. You know, some of the things that she's brought out in some of her other films. But some people might look at that and think that it, again, makes for a really weird combo. That said, at the end of the day, I think Eternals is a really solid Marvel film. I actually think it could be one of the greats, but your mileage may vary. I certainly don't think it's a terrible film, and I certainly don't think it's even a terrible Marvel film. I actually think this movie is way better than movies like Iron Man 2 and Thor 2, by very dint of the fact that it is way more ambitious than those films. And so it gets default points just for trying to do something so different and ambitious than just a typical Marvel origin story. So all that is why I gotta say, don't believe the hate. Check out Eternals. See it in theaters if you feel it's safe to do so. Watch it when it hits Disney Plus, but I think it's really, really good. And I'm curious what you thought of Eternals. Hit me up in the comments. Let me know if you agree with my review, if you violently disagree. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit that bell icon. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I want to give a big thanks to all of my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen. If you support what I do on this YouTube channel or on my podcast, Culturally Relevant, support me at patreon.com/Dave Chen and sign up for bonus audio and video content. All right, that's going to do it for us today. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.